In the autumn of 1932, when the Great Depression had already torn through American families like a relentless storm, a peculiar inheritance was being passed down in a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Harlan County, Kentucky. It wasn't land, it wasn't money, and it certainly wasn't hope. It was something far more disturbing. A vow, a sacred promise that had been whispered through generations of the Crowhurst family, binding daughters to a fate they never chose. Eleanor Crowhurst stood at the kitchen window, her fingers gripping the porcelain sink until her knuckles turned white. At 17, she possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads in church, delicate features framed by auburn hair that caught the afternoon light. But there was something hollow in her hazel eyes, something that spoke of knowledge no girl her age should carry. Behind her, the floorboards creaked. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Her uncle, Thomas Crowhurst, had returned from the coal mines early. The scent of tobacco and sweat announced his presence before his voice did. "Your mother wants to see you in the parlor," he said, his tone measured, almost rehearsed. "It's time we had that talk." Eleanor's stomach twisted. She had known this day would come. Her older sister, Margaret, had sat through the same conversation 3 years ago, just weeks after her 17th birthday. Margaret no longer lived in the house. She resided in a smaller cabin at the edge of their property with Thomas, playing the role of dutiful wife, though no legal document existed to validate the union. The Crowhurst family had operated under this arrangement for as long as anyone could remember. It began with Eleanor's great-great-grandmother, Abigail Crowhurst, who in 1867 had made a deathbed vow to her brother-in-law after her husband perished in a farming accident. The details had been lost to time, twisted and reshaped by each generation's retelling, but the core remained unchanged. Every firstborn daughter would be promised to her uncle, ensuring the family bloodline remained pure and the family property stayed consolidated. Eleanor's mother, Catherine, sat in the parlor with her hands folded in her lap. Her face bore the same hollow expression Eleanor had seen in the mirror. Catherine had been promised to her uncle too, though he had died before the arrangement could be formalized. That twist of fate had allowed Catherine to marry William Crowhurst, Thomas's older brother, and briefly, the family thought the tradition might die. But traditions in families like the Crowhursts didn't die easily. They festered, mutated, and found new ways to survive. "Sit down, Eleanor," Catherine said softly, gesturing to the worn armchair across from her. Eleanor obeyed, her body moving mechanically while her mind raced through possibilities. Running away had crossed her mind 1,000 times, but where would she go? The Depression had made vagrants of millions. Young women without money, without family, without protection, often met fates worse than arranged marriages. "You understand what's expected of you," Catherine continued, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "Your sister has adapted well. Thomas is a good provider. He works hard. He'll take care of you." Eleanor wanted to scream. She wanted to ask why this archaic, grotesque tradition continued when the world outside had moved into the 20th century. But she had watched Margaret ask those same questions. She had witnessed the tears, the arguments, the eventual resignation that settled over her sister like a burial shroud. Thomas entered the parlor and sat beside Catherine. His presence dominated the small room. At 38, he was weathered from years of mining, his hands calloused and stained with coal dust that never quite washed away. He wasn't cruel, Eleanor knew. That somehow made it worse. Cruelty could be fought against, rebelled against, but Thomas's quiet expectation, his belief that this arrangement was normal, natural even, left no enemy to challenge. "We'll do this properly," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of ritual. "Just like it's always been done." The town of Harlan sat nestled between mountains that seemed to close in tighter each year, as if the earth itself wanted to keep the secrets buried in its coal-rich soil. Main Street consisted of a general store, a post office, a church, and a handful of establishments that struggled to stay open as the Depression deepened. Most men worked in the mines when work was available, and most women kept houses that fought a losing battle against the ever-present coal dust. Eleanor had ventured into town 3 days after the parlor conversation, desperate for air that didn't smell like confinement. She walked past the church where Reverend Morrison preached about honor and family every Sunday, past the general store where Mrs. Patterson sold fabric and gossip in equal measure, and found herself at the edge of town where the road stretched toward possibilities she could only imagine. A truck rattled past, heading toward the mining camps up in the hills. The driver, a young man she vaguely recognized from church, tipped his hat but didn't slow down. Everyone in Harlan minded their own business, especially when it came to family matters. The Crowhursts were one of the original families, respected for their longevity, if not for their peculiarities. Margaret appeared beside her, seeming to materialize from the afternoon shadows. Her sister looked older than 20. The light in her eyes dimmed to a persistent grey. She wore a simple cotton dress that had been mended multiple times, and her hands, once delicate like Eleanor's, now bore the roughness of constant labor. "I thought I'd find you here," Margaret said, her voice carrying none of the warmth Eleanor remembered from childhood. "You always did like staring at roads that lead away." "Did you ever think about taking one of those roads?" Eleanor asked, unable to mask the desperation in her voice. Margaret's laugh was bitter and short. "Every single day for the first year. Then you realize there's nowhere to go. No money, no references, no one willing to hire a girl from Harlan with no explanation for why she left her family. And even if you did manage to get away, they'd find you. Family always finds you." The weight of that truth settled over Eleanor like the coal dust that coated everything in Harlan. She wanted to argue, to insist that there must be another way, but Margaret's resignation was contagious. "Does it get easier?" Eleanor whispered. Margaret stared at the mountains for a long moment before answering. "No, you just get better at pretending it does. You learn to separate yourself from what's happening, like you're watching someone else's life from a distance. Thomas isn't violent. He doesn't drink excessively. By most standards, he's a decent man trapped in the same tradition we are. That doesn't make it right. Right and wrong don't matter much when survival is the only goal." Margaret turned to face her sister, and for a brief moment Eleanor saw a flicker of the girl she used to be. "I've come to warn you, don't fight it, Eleanor. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. The more you resist, the more everyone around you will convince you that you're the problem, that you're being ungrateful, that you're betraying the family. Eventually, you'll start to believe them." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't change anything. It never had. "I saw you talking with that boy from the Patterson farm last month," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The one who's been coming around the church social. Whatever you were imagining, let it go now. Thomas has already noticed, and he's made it clear that any friendship you have with other young men needs to end." The tears fell then, hot and angry against Eleanor's cheeks. She had spoken to David Patterson exactly twice, both times in plain view of dozens of people after church. But even that innocent interaction had been monitored, catalogued, and judged as a threat to the arrangement. The Crowhurst farmhouse sat on 30 acres of land that had been in the family since 1843, when Eleanor's great-great-great-grandfather had purchased it from a speculator who never bothered to see what he was selling. The house itself was a sturdy two-story structure built from timber, harvested from the surrounding forest, with a wide front porch that faced east to catch the morning sun. Inside, the walls held portraits of previous Crowhurst generations, stern-faced men and women who stared from their frames with expressions that revealed nothing of their inner lives. Eleanor had spent countless hours studying those faces, searching for some sign that one of them had questioned the tradition, had fought against it, had found a way out. She never found what she was looking for. The evening after her conversation with Margaret, Eleanor sat at the dinner table with her mother, father, and Thomas. Her younger brother, James, had been sent to eat in the kitchen, as these family dinners had become increasingly tense and unsuitable for a 10-year-old's ears. William Crowhurst, Eleanor's father, was a man of few words. He worked the farm with methodical determination, his face weathered by sun and wind into a permanent expression of stoic endurance. He had never openly discussed his feelings about his brother's arrangement with his daughters, but Eleanor had seen him flinch when Margaret moved into the cabin. That flinch was the closest thing to protest she had ever witnessed from him. "The Hendersons are selling their North 40 acres, William said, breaking the silence that had stretched through most of the meal. "Thomas, you should consider making an offer. Coal surveys suggest there's a vein running through there." Thomas nodded, cutting his meat with precise movements. I'll look into it. With Eleanor joining the household soon, additional income would be welcome. The casual way he referenced Eleanor's future, as if it were already decided, already inevitable, made her stomach turn. She set down her fork, unable to force down another bite. Catherine glanced at her daughter with something that might have been sympathy if it weren't so thoroughly mixed with resignation. Eleanor, you've barely touched your food. I'm not hungry. You need to eat, Thomas said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who expected to be obeyed. I won't have you getting sick. The possessiveness in that statement, the implication that her health was already his concern, ignited something in Eleanor that she had been trying to suppress. I'm not yours to worry about. The silence that followed was absolute. William's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Catherine's face drained of colour. Thomas, however, remained calm, his expression unchanging. Eleanor, William said, his voice low with warning. But Eleanor couldn't stop. Weeks of fear and anger and helplessness poured out of her in words she knew she'd regret. This is insane, all of it. We're living like it's still the 1800s, following some deranged promise that should have died generations ago. Margaret is miserable. Mother was nearly trapped in the same situation. And now you're all sitting here, calmly discussing my future like I'm a piece of property to be transferred. Catherine reached across the table, but Eleanor pulled her hand away. Thomas set down his knife and fork with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice remained measured, almost gentle, which somehow made his words more chilling. This family has survived for generations because we honor our commitments, because we understand that individual desires are less important than collective continuity. Your great-great-grandmother understood this. Your grandmother understood this. Your mother understands this. And you will understand it too, in time. I'll never understand it, Eleanor said, her voice shaking, and I'll never accept it. Thomas smiled, a patient expression that made Eleanor feel like a child throwing a tantrum. We'll see. Sleep became impossible for Eleanor after that dinner. She spent her nights staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the wind moving through the trees, the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the valley. Each sound seemed amplified in the darkness, a reminder that she was trapped in a place where time moved differently, where progress had failed to penetrate the stubborn traditions of families who valued continuity over happiness. She began documenting her thoughts in a journal she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed. The entries started as simple recordings of daily events, but quickly evolved into something more desperate, a chronicle of her attempts to find a way out of the situation that tightened around her like a noose. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Eleanor woke to find her mother sitting at the foot of her bed. The sun hadn't yet risen, and in the pre-dawn darkness, Catherine looked like a ghost, pale and insubstantial. I need to tell you something, Catherine whispered. Something I've never told anyone. Eleanor sat up, pulling her blanket around her shoulders against the autumn chill. Her mother's presence at this hour, in this manner, sparked both hope and fear. Catherine's hands twisted in her lap, a nervous gesture Eleanor had seen countless times, but never quite understood until now. When I was your age, when my uncle was still alive and the arrangement was being prepared, I tried to run away. Eleanor's breath caught. This was new information, a crack in the wall of resignation that had always surrounded her mother's story. I made it as far as Lexington, Catherine continued, her voice barely audible. I had saved money from selling eggs, and I convinced a traveling salesman to let me ride in his truck. I thought if I could get to a city, I could find work, disappear into the crowds, start a new life. What happened? Eleanor asked, though part of her didn't want to know. My uncle found me 3 weeks later. He had connections, people who owed him favors. He didn't come alone. He brought your grandfather, your great-uncle, and the sheriff. They told everyone I had been confused, that I had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. The boarding house where I'd been staying, the restaurant where I'd found work washing dishes, they all believed the story. I was brought back in the middle of the night, and by morning it was as if I'd never left. Catherine finally looked at her daughter, and in the dim light, Eleanor could see tears tracking down her mother's face. My uncle died 2 months later in a mining accident. People said it was a blessing, that I'd been spared. But I wasn't spared, Eleanor. I was just given a different cage. Eleanor reached for her mother's hand. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to understand that I've been where you are. I've felt what you're feeling, and I need you to know that no matter how much I wish things were different, no matter how much I hate what's about to happen to you, I can't protect you from it. No one can. The tradition is bigger than any of us. The resignation in her mother's voice was devastating. Eleanor had harbored a small hope that perhaps Catherine, having experienced her own attempted escape, might help her daughter succeed where she had failed. But that hope crumbled in the face of her mother's defeated confession. "So you're telling me not to try?" Eleanor said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I'm telling you that if you do try, be smarter than I was. Don't trust anyone. Don't let sentiment slow you down. And understand that if they catch you, it will be worse than if you'd never tried at all." With those words, Catherine rose from the bed and left the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the cold reality of her situation and the faint, dangerous ember of possibility that her mother had just ignited. Eleanor spent the following week in a state of heightened awareness, her mind constantly working through scenarios and possibilities. Her mother's confession had transformed from a warning into a blueprint, a guide of what not to do. If Catherine had failed because she trusted the wrong person and stayed too close to home, then Eleanor would need to be more careful, more strategic, more willing to cut all ties without hesitation. The first step was money. Eleanor had been selling eggs from the family chickens at the general store for years, but her mother always collected the earnings. Now Eleanor began skimming. A few cents here, a dollar there, amounts small enough not to be noticed but significant enough to accumulate. She hid the money in the same place as her journal, beneath the loose floorboard that had kept her secrets safe for years. The second step was information. Eleanor began paying closer attention to conversations at church and in town, listening for details about train schedules, bus routes, cities where young women might find work. She learned that textile mills in North Carolina were hiring, that there were canning factories in Tennessee that employed women during harvest season, that Louisville had boarding houses specifically for working girls. David Patterson provided unexpected assistance, though he didn't know it. They had spoken only briefly at church socials, but Eleanor had noticed how he watched her, how he seemed to want to say more than propriety aloud. One Sunday after service, she deliberately lingered near the church steps while her family gathered their belongings inside. David approached cautiously, his hat in his hands. He was 19, tall and lean, with the kind of honest face that made him easy to trust. That made him dangerous, Eleanor reminded herself. Her mother had trusted someone too. "Miss Crowhurst," he said, his voice nervous, "I hope you don't mind my speaking to you." "I don't mind," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice neutral even as she scanned the area for watchful eyes. "I wanted to ask if you'd be attending the harvest dance next month. I thought perhaps I could save you a dance, if that would be agreeable." Eleanor's heart ached at the normalcy of the question, at the simple romance it implied. In another life, in another family, she would have said yes, without hesitation. She would have looked forward to that dance, to the possibility of courtship, to a future built on choice rather than obligation. "I don't think that would be possible," she said carefully. "My family has certain expectations." David's expression clouded with confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like anger. "I've heard things," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "About your family, about your sister. I didn't want to believe them, but the way your uncle watches you, the way everyone seems to act like it's normal. I don't understand how this is allowed to happen." Eleanor glanced toward the church doors, panic rising in her chest. If anyone overheard this conversation, if anyone reported back to Thomas, the consequences would be immediate and severe. "You shouldn't speak of things you don't understand." "Then help me understand," David pressed. "If you need help, if you need a way out, I can help you. My cousin drives a delivery truck to Louisville twice a week. He could get you there, no questions asked." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. Eleanor wanted to accept, wanted to trust this young man whose earnest concern seemed genuine, But her mother's warning echoed in her mind. Don't trust anyone. Don't let sentiment slow you down. I appreciate your concern, Eleanor said, her voice formal and distant. But I assure you everything is fine. I should go. My family is waiting. She walked away before David could respond, before she could change her mind, before the tears that threatened could fall. That evening, she added David's information to her mental catalogue of resources, not because she intended to use his help, but because knowing an option existed provided a small measure of comfort in her increasingly constrained world. Margaret visited 2 days later, bringing fresh bread and news that Thomas had begun preparing the cabin for Eleanor's arrival. New curtains had been ordered. The bedroom was being repainted. The mundane domesticity of these preparations made the situation feel even more surreal, as if they were planning a normal wedding rather than the continuation of a grotesque family tradition. November arrived with cold rain that turned the roads to mud and kept most of Harlan's residents close to their fires. The mining operations slowed as the weather made the mountain roads nearly impassable, which meant Thomas spent more time at the farmhouse, his presence a constant reminder of Eleanor's approaching fate. The date had been set, December 20th, just after Eleanor's 18th birthday. There would be no ceremony, no public acknowledgement, just a quiet transition from her parents' house to Thomas's cabin, as if she were simply moving into a new room rather than entering into an arrangement that would define the rest of her life. Eleanor's savings had grown to $18.35, enough for a bus ticket to Louisville, with a little left over for food and a night's lodging. She had memorized the bus schedule. The morning bus departed at 6:15 from the depot in town, which meant she would need to leave the house no later than 5:30 to arrive in time. The plan formed gradually, each piece falling into place like a puzzle. She would leave on December 18th, 2 days before the scheduled transition, early enough that the family might assume she was simply having second thoughts, late enough that wedding preparations would be underway and the household would be distracted. She would take only what she could carry in a small bag. Too much luggage would slow her down and make her conspicuous. She had already begun setting aside practical clothes, sturdy shoes, items that would help her blend into the working-class crowds of a city. The hardest part was James. Her younger brother had no idea what was happening, no understanding of the tradition that governed his sisters' lives. He still looked at Eleanor with uncomplicated affection, still asked her to help with his schoolwork, still assumed she would always be there. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table working through his arithmetic problems, James looked up at her with his wide brown eyes and asked, "Are you really going to live with Uncle Thomas?" Eleanor's pencil froze above the paper. "Where did you hear that?" "I heard Mother and Father talking. They said you'd be moving to the cabin like Margaret did, but I don't understand why. Why can't you stay here?" The innocence of the question broke something in Eleanor. She wanted to tell him the truth, to plant seeds of understanding that might protect any daughters he might one day have. But James was only 10, and burdening him with knowledge he couldn't act upon seemed cruel. "Sometimes families have traditions," Eleanor said carefully. "Things they've done for a long time, even if those things don't make sense to everyone." "Do you want to go?" James asked, his child's intuition cutting through the diplomatic explanation. Eleanor met her brother's eyes and made a decision. "No," she said simply, "I don't." James nodded, accepting this truth without judgment. "Then you shouldn't go. If something makes you sad, you shouldn't have to do it." The simplicity of his logic, the uncomplicated morality of a child who hadn't yet learned that the world operates on more complex and often unjust principles, made Eleanor's throat tighten with emotion. She pulled her brother into a hug, memorizing the feel of him, the way he still smelled like soap and grass and innocence. "You're a good brother," she whispered. "Don't forget that." Thomas observed this interaction from the doorway, his face unreadable. After James returned to his arithmetic, Thomas entered the kitchen and poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. "You're good with him," Thomas said, his tone conversational. "You'll be a good mother someday." The implication was clear, and it made Eleanor's skin crawl. She had tried not to think about that aspect of the arrangement, about the children that would be expected, about the way those children would carry the genetic burden of a family that married within itself. "I should finish helping James with his homework," Eleanor said. turning back to the table. Of course. Thomas lingered for a moment longer, then left the kitchen, but his presence remained, heavy and inescapable, a shadow that darkened every corner of the house. That night, Eleanor added a new entry to her journal, writing by candlelight long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. She documented everything, the history of the tradition, her mother's failed escape attempt, her own plans. She wrote it all down in careful detail, knowing that if her escape failed, this journal might be the only evidence that she had tried, that she had not simply accepted her fate. She ended the entry with a single line: "If I don't make it out, let this be proof that I tried to choose my own life." December arrived with unusual warmth, the kind of unseasonable weather that made old-timers shake their heads and predict a harsh winter to follow. The coal mines operated at full capacity, taking advantage of the clear roads and good conditions. Thomas worked long shifts, coming home exhausted and coal-stained, which gave Eleanor more freedom to move about without constant supervision. The general store had received a shipment of Christmas goods, modest offerings given the Depression's grip on the economy, but enough to bring a sense of normalcy to the town. Eleanor volunteered to help decorate the church for the Christmas services, an activity that put her in contact with other young women and provided opportunities to gather information. Sarah Mitchell, the Reverend's daughter, had recently returned from a year working at a textile mill in Charlotte. She spoke of the experience with a mixture of pride and exhaustion, describing 12-hour shifts, cramped boarding house conditions, and wages that barely covered expenses. But she had earned her own money, she emphasized. She had made her own choices. "Why did you come back?" Eleanor asked as they hung evergreen boughs along the church pews. Sarah's expression grew complicated. "The mill closed. Too many workers, not enough orders. Half of us were let go in a single day. I couldn't afford to stay in Charlotte without work, and there weren't other jobs available, so I came home." The answer was discouraging but also instructive. Eleanor realized that escaping Harlan was only the first challenge. Surviving in the world beyond required skills, resources, and luck she might not possess. But staying was not an option, which meant she would have to be willing to endure whatever hardships awaited her. Margaret appeared at the church near the end of the decorating session. She had become increasingly gaunt, her cheekbones prominent beneath her pale skin. She claimed to have caught a cold, but Eleanor suspected the weight loss came from stress, from the psychological toll of living a life she had never chosen. "Mother wants you home early," Margaret said, her voice flat. "Thomas is bringing someone to dinner tonight, a mining supervisor from the company. Father wants to make a good impression." The subtext was clear. Eleanor was expected to be present, to play the role of dutiful daughter, to demonstrate that she was well adjusted and prepared for her transition into Thomas's household. Any sign of rebellion or distress would reflect poorly on the family and jeopardize Thomas's professional relationships. The dinner was exactly as uncomfortable as Eleanor had anticipated. The supervisor, a man named Garrett who wore a suit that looked expensive even if it was slightly out of fashion, spoke primarily to William and Thomas about production numbers and safety concerns. Catherine and Eleanor served the meal, refilled glasses, and remained largely silent as was expected of women in such gatherings. But Garrett's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Frances, who wore her hair in the modern short style, studied Eleanor with undisguised interest. During a lull in the men's conversation, she leaned forward and addressed Eleanor directly. "Catherine tells me you'll be keeping house for your uncle soon," Frances said, her tone pleasant but her eyes calculating. "That's an unusual arrangement." The room fell silent. Catherine's face drained of color. William's hand tightened around his fork. Thomas, however, smiled easily, as if the question were perfectly innocent. "It's a family tradition," Thomas explained. "Eleanor will be helping to manage the household while also learning about the mining business. It's quite practical, really, keeps the family close and ensures efficiency." Frances's expression suggested she saw through the carefully crafted explanation, but she had the social grace not to press further. "How modern," she said, her tone making it impossible to tell if she meant it as a compliment or criticism. The evening concluded without further incident, but Eleanor had seen the look in Frances's eyes, the mixture of pity and disapproval. That look stayed with her long after the guests departed, a reminder that people outside the family could see the wrongness of the situation, even if they felt powerless to intervene. Later that night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she heard raised voices from her parents' bedroom. She couldn't make out the words, but her mother's tone carried anger and frustration, emotions Catherine rarely expressed openly. Her father's responses were quieter, more measured, but the tension was unmistakable. Eleanor pressed her ear against the wall, straining to hear. "She's our daughter." Catherine's voice rose just loud enough to be audible. "Our daughter, William, not a piece of property to be traded like land or livestock." William's response was too quiet to hear, but whatever he said only seemed to increase Catherine's distress. "I won't do this again," Catherine continued, her voice breaking. "I won't watch another daughter go through what I went through, what Margaret is going through. There has to be another way." Silence followed, long and heavy. When William finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of defeat. "There is no other way. You know that. We've always known that." Eleanor pulled away from the wall, her heart pounding. Her mother was fighting for her, challenging her father in a way that Eleanor had never witnessed. But even Catherine's rare burst of resistance seemed futile against the immovable force of family tradition. December 18th dawned cold and clear, the unseasonable warmth finally giving way to proper winter weather. Eleanor woke at 4 in the morning, her body tense with anticipation and fear. This was the day. In 2 hours, she would either be on a bus heading toward freedom, or she would be caught, dragged back, and confined even more strictly until the transition could be completed. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes she had set aside. Sturdy cotton dress, warm sweater, sensible shoes. Her small bag was already packed and hidden beneath her bed, containing 2 changes of clothes, her journal, her savings, and a photograph of James. She had debated including the photograph, worried it might make her sentimental at a moment when she needed to be ruthless. But in the end, she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. The house was silent as she crept down the stairs, avoiding the boards she knew would creak. She moved through the kitchen, past the parlor where portraits of dead Crowhursts watched from the walls, and reached the front door. Her hand was on the handle when a voice stopped her. "I knew you'd try." Eleanor turned to find Thomas standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the early hour. Her stomach dropped. He had been waiting for her, anticipating this exact scenario. "I'm leaving," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You can't stop me." Thomas's expression was almost sad. "I can. And I will. Do you think you're the first to try? Your mother tried. Your grandmother tried. Every generation someone tries, and every generation they're brought back. The tradition is stronger than any individual will." "Then let me go," Eleanor pleaded, abandoning pride for desperation. "Let me be the one who gets away. You can find someone else. Marry someone who actually wants to be with you. This doesn't have to continue." Thomas shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. This isn't about what I want or what you want. This is about continuity, about honoring the vows that have held this family together for generations. Breaking that chain would dishonor everyone who came before us." "They're dead," Eleanor said, anger flaring through her fear. "They're dead and they don't care. The only people being hurt by this tradition are the ones still living." "Go back to your room," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "We'll discuss this with your parents in the morning." Eleanor made her decision in a split second. She jerked the door open and ran, her bag clutched to her chest, her feet pounding against the frozen ground. She heard Thomas shout behind her, heard the door slam as he gave chase, but she didn't look back. The road stretched before her in the pre-dawn darkness, leading toward town, toward the bus depot, toward escape. She had perhaps a 5-minute head start, maybe less. Thomas was stronger, faster, but Eleanor was driven by desperation and the knowledge that this was her only chance. She ran with everything she had, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs burning with effort. The town appeared ahead, still mostly dark, only a few lights visible in early rising households. The bus depot sat at the far end of Main Street, and Eleanor could see lights in the window, could see the silhouette of the bus already waiting at the platform. She was 50 yards away when Thomas caught her. His hand closed around her arm, spinning her around with enough force that she stumbled. Her bag fell to the ground, spilling its contents across the frozen dirt. "Please," Eleanor sobbed, fighting against his grip. "Please, just let me go." Thomas's face was impassive, determined, showing no trace of the gentleness he usually affected. "It's for your own good. You'll understand eventually, they all do." But as he began to pull her back toward the road, a voice cut through the morning air. "Let her go." David Patterson stepped out of the shadows near the depot, his young face set with determination. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood his father, his older brother, and 3 other men Eleanor recognized from the church. They formed a line between Eleanor and the road back to the farm. Thomas's grip loosened in surprise. "This is family business. It doesn't concern you." "I think it does," David's father said, his voice calm but firm. "We've known about your family's ways for years, and we've stayed quiet because that's how things are done around here. But I can't watch a girl run toward freedom and not help her reach it. My conscience won't allow it." For a long moment no one moved. The standoff held in the cold morning air, balanced on the edge of violence. Then Thomas released Eleanor's arm, his expression transforming from determination to resignation. "If she leaves, she can never come back," he said quietly. "She'll be dead to this family. Do you understand that, Eleanor? You'll have no home, no family, no one to turn to if things go wrong." Eleanor picked up her bag, stuffing her scattered belongings back inside with shaking hands. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than she felt. "I understand. And I'm still leaving." The bus driver appeared in the depot doorway, drawn by the commotion. "We're departing in 5 minutes," he called. "Anyone coming needs to board now." Eleanor walked toward the bus, half expecting Thomas to stop her again, but he simply watched. David accompanied her to the steps, pressing something into her hand as she climbed aboard. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but it should help." Eleanor looked down to find a small envelope containing what felt like money. Tears blurred her vision. "Thank you for everything. Be safe," David said simply. The bus pulled away as the sun began to rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Eleanor pressed her face to the window, watching Harlan recede into the distance. She saw Thomas standing alone on Main Street, growing smaller with each passing second. She saw the church where she had spent every Sunday of her life. She saw the general store, the post office, all the familiar landmarks of a childhood that had ended the moment she chose freedom over tradition. The future was uncertain. She had less than $25, no concrete prospects, and no guarantee that she would succeed where her mother had failed. But as the bus carried her away from Harlan County, away from the Crowhurst family and their sacred vow, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt hope, and for now that was enough. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.